I started drinking at 13 years old. Now, I'm from a small town in Yorkshire in the north of the UK, where the normal thing was to grow up, get to adolescence, teenage years, barely old enough to even work a paper round and start getting absolutely shit-faced. Now, if you're anything like me and you grew up in the 90s or over the past 30 to 40 years, you'll know a lot has changed. And what was normal back then, the habits you've built, the kind of life you live, is probably what's holding you back in your life today. Now, despite getting some high-level qualifications, usually fueled by 24-hour deadlines and about 5 cans of the White Monster, and becoming quote-unquote successful on paper, I was truly unhappy in life. And even though I was working hard in the gym, but I'd built like a decent body, I'd done all the things you were supposed to do, I felt absolutely shit. I was waking up with no energy every day. My drinking had become pretty severe and I was completely stressed out with anxiety. So now I've managed to get completely off alcohol. I'm over 3.5 years sober at this point. I've built my body to a point where I pretty much get stared at by everyone when I walk down the street without a shirt on. And I wake up with more energy now than I had at 15. Because after over 10 years of trial and error, I finally figured out what actually works. And this is what's let me now train just 2 days per week. I actually spend most of my time just chilling out with friends or doing what I love most, which is actually working on business. And I did this by building what I call a lifestyle body. So I wanted to make this video to walk you through the journey of going from that young boy who was almost destined to be another casualty in his Irish family tradition to where I've got to today. So it all started when I was 13. So my dad was having a birthday party in the house and there was a lot of drinking and everything going on. And around this time, I'd had the idea that I wanted to actually start drinking. Not properly, but I just wanted to get a taste of what it was like. So that night I plotted for about 2 hours to go find the perfect timing to go down, sneak and get some beers and bring them up. And I sort of half managed to successfully do this and got the beers up to my room. And I just remember having the first drink and yeah, all my anxiety just seemed like it just flushed out of my body. And I probably knew from that point that alcohol was going to be a big part of my life and that for my anxiety, for my lack of confidence, for my insecurities, it was going to be probably the biggest thing I was going to lean on, a coping mechanism for the next decade. And unfortunately for me, I learned this at 13. Now, at that age, there wasn't really many scenarios that I could actually use alcohol for. I mean, my life was pretty much go to school, come home, play Modern Warfare 2, maybe, go out on bikes for a few hours. Normal fucking 13-year-old shit. But I seemed to have this thing where I knew, like, from seeing people around me that, house parties were coming up, maybe like the typical first, party birthdays at 14 and stuff like this. And I didn't have any way of getting alcohol at all at this point. I didn't have any contacts. My parents were definitely not going to buy me any. So it was pretty much a case of me trying to figure out how I could drink without anyone knowing and also not being able to get it myself. But I'd say over the next 6 to 12 months, I had a lot of friends who started to get into drinking a little bit more. We drink in like parks, in fields, in the skate parks. We'd pretty much always be able to get alcohol of some kind, whether it was someone would steal a bottle of wine or a bottle of vodka, or we started to get a couple of connections where people would go get us beers and stuff. But this just made our weekends go from like, what are we going to do to where are we going to drink? And there was a big part of me that was doing this just to fit in. Like, I grew up a bit of a shy kid. I didn't really feel like I fit in. I was sort of just clever enough to hang out with the nerds, but not really on their level. I was into music. I was into sort of being a bit of a nerd in like hobbies and stuff. So I never really fit in. And as soon as I started drinking, I had this sort of social acceptance with people that I quickly developed this identity that I was sort of just a big time up for the sesh at any point. You know, if we needed someone there, if we needed numbers to get the party going, you know, I would be there. I'd probably be there before everyone. So I'd say that it was probably half drinking out of insecurity and wanting to fit in. And then half of it was actually wanting to use alcohol for my actual confidence in myself, for my own self image, and just and mostly just dealing with the sort of demons and worries in my head of that I didn't really enjoy being a sober person around people. I found it very difficult to socialize, to, you know, make contact with people, to speak to girls, which is obviously a big part of why people start drinking as well at such a young age. You know, everyone's heard of the term Dutch courage, and I pretty much needed Dutch courage, but in every area of my life. So if I wasn't so young, then I probably would have started drinking just every day through the daytime, not to get pissed out of my head or anything, but, you know, just to always stay at that nice 3 to 4 drinks where your inhibitions are so low that you don't mind what you say, that you're not double thinking everything that comes out of your mouth. And I just always wanted to be that person. And by the time I'd hit age 16, I was pretty much drinking 4 to 5 times a week. Now, again, this didn't seem like it was, you know, the worst thing ever to be doing. It just seemed like maybe I had a drink 1, maybe 2 days more than everyone else. And like, I wasn't getting shit faced on a Wednesday at 16. You know, it wasn't like a childhood alcoholic. Well, depending on what part of the world you're in, maybe it would have been fair to call me that. But in the UK, it was very much just a part of culture. I know places like Germany, Australia, obviously Ireland, is all very much, we're brought into this as a bit of a, you know, a merry family tradition. Now, looking back, it would have been so much easier to just develop myself without booze, to not have to rely on anything. And hopefully it would have made me force the level up and become the person that I wanted to become. And I'd say that drinking definitely didn't do that. It just put this mask over me. And it pretty much felt a little bit like the secret weapon, you know, the superpowers. So obviously, if you take the superpowers away, you're just bare. You've lost your armor. And if I kept this going, I would have pretty much spent my whole life being this social dweeb who couldn't talk to anyone without having 5 or 6 beers, or I would have just become all out drinker, probably having 7, 8, 9, 10 beers a day, and just not being able to even really do anything in life. But as long as I'd had a beer, then at least I'd, you know, be the fucking chatty guy who was up at the parties. And yeah, so I got to 18, went off to university, did the whole freshers party, drinking, just being degenerates. I remember actually when I first arrived, from pretty much the first day onwards, what we call freshers in the UK, I'm not sure what the American term is, but I pretty much went out for, I think, 18 days in a row. Now, financially, that's probably the worst decision I could have made. But at the time, it was the only way that I knew how to meet people. Again, this was probably all insecurity driven, of feeling inadequate, having low confidence, not being able to get girls, and just really relying on booze. But along this time, I was also balancing out my fitness journey. So I'd actually started training at about 16 years old, getting into, you know, proper weightlifting and really trying to transform my body. So as I said, I was always the skinny kid. I was scrawny. I probably got bullied a little bit by even my friends. You know, I was that sort of kid where, you know, everything would just bounce off me and I wouldn't have the confidence to speak up, or to, you know, I'd like no respect from people. So I got into the gym at about 16 and just pretty much spent the next 5 years just all out weightlifting. So me and my friend, that's all we did. We pretty much would get to the gym every single day. I think I was training probably 6 days per week from the first year. And it would be pretty much a case of get my school or sixth form day done or whatever, get straight to the gym, get probably a 90-minute session in, come home, protein shakes, whatever, gym bro meal, and then pretty much crack a beer straight after. So I quickly fell into this double life of where I was like becoming more and more Mr. Fitness and building a decent physique. Well, it was okay, it was a 16, 17, 18-year-old physique. Nothing to write home about. But at the same time, I was out to the clubs till 4 a.m., the last one to get kicked out, and then trying to scav the house parties. I was really just living these two double lives. And this went on for so many years. And even getting through uni, starting jobs, I started working in oil and gas. I did a lot of, on the surface, good level shit. But I was pretty much like a pocket fucking alcoholic. Like, I was able to drink. I'd love drinking on my own, I'd be with people, whatever. So this quickly became a situation where I was training and working hard in the gym, but 6, 7, 8 beers was a normal Tuesday night. That's what I'd have to wash down my tea with. So I ended up in this place where I had to pick one lane, but I wasn't, because I had such a pull to alcohol from the lack of confidence, from my insecurities. And this actually made my sober life even worse, because it's a bit like the use it or lose it situation, because I was spending so much time drinking while socializing that I pretty much, apart from work where you're just fucking, yes, okay, will do, day-to-day shit, I didn't need any sort of social skills or confidence or charisma because I was drinking. So that was my charisma. So to the point where I tried a few nights to go out sober, and it was just a fucking absolute disaster. So there was no chance I was giving up booze, but there was also obviously no chance that I was going to stop training at this point and just turn into a fat mess. So I was really just in this limbo for so many years. And this went on from probably 2014 up until 2021. And I'd say around 2021 is where my head started to switch, and I was able to make at least the plan to start moving in the right direction. But the thing is, gym was the most important thing in my life, bar none. More important than booze, than women, than partying, the drinking, all of it. All I wanted to do was train, to build my body, to beat I had my logbooks, I had spreadsheets, I was, researching 7, 8 hours a day. Every single hour that I wasn't drinking or having to do my actual day-to-day work was just all about the gym. That's all I cared about. That's all I spoke to people about. And funnily enough, people started to tell me, you should probably become a PT. And several years on, that is what I ended up doing, and which is what led me here today. But I was still living that party life. So no matter what I did, I'd stop making progress. And I actually started to look worse. So I was training harder and harder, but my body was diminishing. I was seeing less gains. My face was getting puffy. But I started to get to a point where drinking was actually ruining my training. So this was just when hangovers started coming in. I stopped being able to handle them, man. Do you know what I mean? I just couldn't do it anymore. For some reason, at 16, 17, 18, you can just crack on, fucking power through. You getting battered till 3 a.m. and then you're in the gym at 9 the next morning. It wasn't working anymore. I couldn't hack it. I remember I was probably early 20s, and I went out for a sesh with my mate, and we got in on Monday morning. So I don't know whether we were drinking. We probably drank Saturday night and Sunday watching football, and probably Friday as well. And we had bench press that Monday morning. And I remember doing 2 sets, and I had to go throw up out. I didn't even make it to the toilet. I had to go out of the fire door and just throw up out of the side. And this was a bit of a moment where I thought, you need to fucking sort this out, mate. So now we've probably got into lockdown 2020, 2021 era. And this is when I started to really start feeling pretty shit. So no longer did I just wake up feeling all right. The hangovers were taking their toll. So I started to cut my drinking down into certain days. So the plan was to have, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and probably most of Fridays actually feeling good enough. But I just started waking up like with zero energy. Like every single day started to pile on. And this happened pretty much within 6 months. And I hadn't started drinking more. I hadn't changed my diet. I hadn't really changed anything. The only difference was in my work. So I'd started doing more intense work, working probably 12-hour days, and then doing a master's degree on the side. So I had so much shit to be getting on with. And as I said, I wasn't a typical, alcoholic. I was getting shit done and then just drinking slyly. Well, to be honest, I was even drinking whilst doing assignments and coursework. And I was actually using booze to get me through and deal with the stress. So, I always felt like I was the best person on about 3 or 4 beers. I pretty much would have no anxiety. I'd feel confident. I'd feel relaxed. So this is a very much a dangerous place to be, because you start to then become reliant on booze, not just for your social life, but for your actual day-to-day work as well. But I started using my head and realised that I need to lay off the booze. So I did manage to form a sort of agreement with myself where I would let myself crack on with life through the week, but every day, just no energy. I remember so many days I'd wake up, normal time, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be at work trying to do an assignment or in a lecture, and I'd be falling asleep at like 10 in the morning. My confidence was just getting worse and worse, to the point where I think lockdown didn't help, to where everyone was so isolated. But it got to a point where I didn't even really want to go out the house. I wasn't bothered about socializing with anyone. I just had no interest really in anything. And my drive was gone. I had no ambition. So I started to go down a bit of a rabbit hole looking into, health, supplementation, biohacking. And I got really caught up in this whole, biohacking sphere when it first sort of came onto the scene around that 2021 mark. So I started, scouring Reddit. I'd be on the forums for hours a day. I found, the typical like more plates, more dates, Greg Doucette and all this sort of stuff. And then sort of went down the rabbit hole of peptides and hormone sort of, as I said, biohacking, this sort of stuff. And then found guys like Vigorous Steve, Leo's Longevity. And just really got caught up in trying to optimize. I think that was the big word that year. I was just trying to optimize. And I eventually figured that maybe I should get a testosterone test, because everything I've been reading and seeing had all been pointing back to, you're feeling all these symptoms, then you've probably got some sort of low testosterone. But it was never a plan for me to even do anything hormone related. As in, like, I was never wanting to get on TRT. I'd never wanted to do any of this manipulation, stuff like this. So it was very much, how can I try to maximize my natural testosterone, which I'm sure you've probably wanted to achieve yourself. But the thing is, I was still in my early 20s, so it didn't really add up why I would be feeling like this, and why, if I did have low testosterone at that age, despite training so hard, despite, doing most of the stuff right, I wasn't fat, I wasn't really anyone who you would expect to be low testosterone, and I had a pretty decent physique. So I had people around me saying, well, you've actually got a decent body, so you probably have high testosterone. But no one really sees the symptoms of having low energy and how you actually feel inside every day. So I decided to get a test. And I'd been feeling shit for about 6 months at this point, and I'd tried every single supplement regime, like the standard omega 3s and cod liver oil, zinc, vitamin D. I'd done all this sort of standard shit. So there wasn't really much else. I did have a bit of an extensive list, and there wasn't really that much else that I knew of at the time that would really be able to help me. So, in a way, I was sort of hoping that I would see a low result because, it would give me some sort of closure that there actually is a problem here and it's not all just in my head. So, I got this test and it came back after about a week and it was low. And I just remember having this sort of feeling over me where, like, I knew it. Like, I wasn't pissed off, I wasn't sad. I just felt like I've got an answer, or at least I've got something where I can start asking some questions now, and I've got a direction because I actually went to a doctor around this time before I got tested to see if they would give me a test, and they pretty much waved me off. They just said like, "Nah, you're young, you probably don't," and they actually offered me one thing, which was some antidepressants. And at the time, because I wasn't really aware of like how you get a test done and if I should be going down this route, and these depressive feelings were coming on slowly over the time, I started considering it. And I was at an age where I was a little bit more naive and impressionable. So I did consider it for a while. And since probably 4 or 5 years prior to that point, I'd had these feelings sort of coming and going. And this had stemmed back to around 2017, where I actually went through pretty much my first, heartbreak as a young lad. I wouldn't say I was depressed looking back, but I was definitely in the most depressive state I've ever felt. And this went on for a solid 2 years, which I managed to sort of hide from everyone. But it sort of, it lingered on for a long time. So when I got to the point where I had all these low T symptoms, to where, my confidence was shot, to where I had no energy. And then plus I was sort of just getting over this long-term heartbreak I had to deal with. When the doctor posed me these antidepressants, it seemed like a sensible thing because they're in the chair and they're saying these will be really good for you. These could sort you out. You don't have low testosterone. You're just depressed. And I decided, nah, I'm not going to do it because I don't know why. I've never really agreed with Western medicine. I think, there's healthier ways to go about things. And obviously getting into the whole biohacking scene, this sort of was my fallback anyway, that I knew there was a better way to go about things anyway. So I left the doctors that day, got back on my Reddit forums and put together probably the most extensive hormone biohacking research doc you've ever seen. I must have that somewhere, but yeah, I got into supplementing absolutely everything. I was doing all the regimens, so I started getting up, doing the cold showers, I was squatting 3 times per day, and I had this supplement list of Tonka Ali, Fedosia agrestis, boron. I was doing like a 30k vitamin D per day, so I was doing absolutely everything I could. And I ran this for about a year and I pretty much got no results. So I was looking at about 18 months of all this biohacking shit at this point. And I was still drinking, but it was starting to become a little bit more controlled. And it was like less frequent, but then more all out. So I was pretty much making it weekend to weekend with only having a few drinks in between, maybe a few on a Wednesday. And then I'd pretty much make it from Sunday to Friday with a little drink in between because I was so focused on this time just to try start feeling better again. Like the pain had got so bad that I was willing to do anything. And this was the first time where I knew that I was going to tried to phase alcohol out. Now, probably the big reason why I kept drinking for so long was for that anxiety release, was to deal with the stress. But on the other side, on a morning, I was pretty much smashing caffeine. Like, what today is considered a pretty reasonable dose, to the wrong person is probably one of the worst things you can do for their anxiety and their stress levels. So I was probably putting back 5, 6 cups of tea per day, which, surprise, surprise, Mr. Yorkshireman drinks tea. But this bled into my anxiety really bad. So I would feel super jittered, super anxious, stressed out. And it pretty much became like a cycle of drinking so much on a night and then having to absolutely pile of caffeine the next day. But then I'd feel so stressed out and anxious then on a night I'd need to drink again. Now, obviously, you've got your own life and finances and all the stress of all that sort of stuff. But it sort of became from wanting to sort my low energy out to getting to a point where my anxiety started to really take over. And you can probably relate to having a really shit night's sleep and then having 3 or 4 cups of coffee. The energy's not real. It's not the same. And over the next probably 2 or 3 years was where I went from the absolute worst I felt to getting off absolutely everything and getting into what I'd now say is what just keeps getting better every month over and over to the best I've ever felt. So now fast forward around end of October 2021. This was pretty much the breakthrough moment in my mindset. So I went out for a works Halloween party sort of thing, and I just remember getting so drunk that night that I woke up in my room the next day fully clothed and there was mud all down my jeans. I couldn't find my wallet. I checked my phone and I had about 12 missed calls from all the PT sessions that I'd missed that morning. So I pretty much wiped out all my morning clients, woke up with no money, and, I probably had one of the worst hangovers of my life. And I just remember sitting there thinking, nah, I can't do this anymore. And had a bit of a word with myself where I just said, like, whatever it takes, over the next year, I'm going to get off the booze. I'm going to fucking do it. Now, saying it and doing it were two completely different things, but every month I was slowly getting closer and closer to a point where I felt actually comfortable, giving this a shot. So I'd say over the next 10 months through pretty much 2022 up until summer, that whole 6 months was just trying my best to see how long I could go without booze. And a lot of times it was about 2 weeks, but it was fucking 2 weeks more than I'd ever done. And, sometimes I'd make it to like maybe 2.5 weeks, but there was never, I'd never managed to do a dry January or a sober October, anything like this. Now, I actually had my final drink in July 2022. So this month was the fucking final boss of all final bosses in Ibiza. So I actually went for a week-long sesh in July with the boys and pretty much had the fucking sesh of my life. I mean, the first day I got there, I managed to get drunk 3 times that day. Went to Ushuaia, went to High, went to Mambo's, did everything. And even up until the last minute of fucking boarding the plane, I was drinking in the airport. I flew home that day and woke up the next morning with not the biggest depression in my life, but the biggest blues I'd ever felt. Now, it wasn't blues from Ibiza or from drinking or anything. I just felt fucking fed up with life. I'd pretty much just had an escapism for the last week. Dropped back down into the north of the UK, looked around and just thought, what the fuck am I doing with myself? And it was from that day where I was like, I need a month. I just need a month off the booze. Let me see what happens. I need, it wasn't even just to see if I could do it. My body fucking needed it after that month off. So that was it. From that day onwards, I was just going to try to do 30 days. Now, that first 30 days for most people will be the hardest thing they ever go through. For me, it wasn't too bad because I just had the biggest bender of my life. Pretty much the first 2 weeks didn't even count. Like, I would literally pay to not have to drink for 2 weeks after that fucking sesh. So I pretty much had, like, 2.5 weeks to go after the point where I actually sort of came back into the room. I remember the third week was probably a bit of a make or break, where there was something on that weekend. And for me, I didn't trust myself around it. So I just took myself out of it and just said, I'm not going to speak to anyone. I'm not going to be at the parties. I'm not going to be around family. And I pretty much just isolated myself. And this managed to get me to 30 days, no alcohol for the first time since I was 13. And I'm about age 24 at this point. So, that's 11 years. And I've done my first sober month in 11 years. Now, within that first 30 days, mate, I felt unbelievable. Like, I'd never felt that good. I had so much more just excitement for life. I didn't feel like I needed, just to rely on something so often. But the feelings were so fucking good, I wasn't going to give that up. So it wasn't even let's see how long I can do this. It was just so clear to me that why would I start feeling like shit again? So that next 2, 3, and 4 months were probably the most transformative periods I've ever had in my life. So I started waking up at about probably 5 in the morning for the first time. I started journaling, I started meditating, I started going on walks, all the fucking self-improvement bollocks. I'd probably just read Rich Poor Dad at this point. And I just got into really, sorting my shit out. And obviously each one of these all stacked up as well. I felt better and better. My energy started to slowly creep up. My body started to actually make progress again. And life just started to really feel like it was going in the right direction. And I remember I got to about Christmas time, which will have been July, August, September, October, November. Yeah, probably 5 months in. And on Christmas Day, the plan was to have a drink on Christmas Day because, since I was a young lad, I'd never not had a drink with my family. Me and my dad would always have a drink. I'd always go out with friends at some point. And that Christmas was the big make or break whether, I was going to carry this on or not, or whether I was just going to have, maybe more of a casual relationship. But I sort of knew, there is no casual relationship with alcohol, especially for me with an addictive personality. I was either going to fall back into my old ways or by some, I wouldn't say miracle, but by some change of events, I was going to not drink all Christmas and then go into 2023 completely sober. And I sat there with a glass of rum and coke, which was my choice of poison for probably about 6 years, especially, on a Christmas day. And someone had actually bought me quite an expensive bottle. So I was sat there just looking at the drink and I didn't have it. I just looked at it, and for the first time, I'd looked at a drink and I genuinely didn't want it. I'd lost the emotional feel towards it. It just looked like, a glass of Coke. And I got to a point where now alcohol had become just another drug. So instead of thinking, do I fancy a beer? It was, do I want some drugs tonight? Which, if you actually look at alcohol, it is probably the most dangerous, secret, sneaky drug in the world because of how socially accepted it is. Now, obviously not all drugs are equal, but booze just became in that bracket with weed and coke and whatever, MDMA, this sort of like middle bracket. And booze just became in there where, it would take a very special occasion to pull any of these out. Now, no, I'm not Mr. Anti-drugs. I've still smoked a fair bit over the last few years. If I went back to Ibiza, you can bet the mollies are coming out. That's just how it is. But for me, alcohol just isn't a drug that I'm interested in. So yeah, I went into the next period of my life, age 25 to 30, completely sober. I was pretty much the only person I knew who was doing this. And I actually went traveling. So if you've been traveling or you know about it, you'll know it's just an absolute fucking party island. So I went out to Australia, then to Thailand, then to Laos, and pretty much was living in dorms, staying with 10, 12 people, going out to bars, socializing, completely sober. And this was probably the weirdest but best experience and best thing that I've ever done. For one, it was such a good talking point with people. Two, it just fucking blew people's mind. They couldn't really comprehend how you could be out in, party islands and in hostels and sort of living that sort of, traveler life, but not be drinking. And I think three, by far the most important, it just destroyed that fucking social anxiety. It really started to level me up so quick, faster than anything I've ever done. And, even if I'd done this even with a few beers, I think it wouldn't have had the same level up on my character, because when you've got no alcohol, no cocaine, no anything like that, you're on your own. And when you're solo traveling, you've got to fucking make friends. If you don't make friends, you're fucked. So this forced me into all these situations where my back was against the wall and I had literally no option but to socialize and make friends without having a single drink. And this was probably the fastest level up I've ever experienced, because, within the space of 2 or 3 nights, you pretty much have to try to gather together some form of, friends or a gang who you can travel with. You need to sort of start making these connections, because a lot of this travel sort of sphere happens in like directions. So people will travel sort of round this way and all follow the same direction. People will go this way and you will meet people again. You start here and you fly to here. You could meet someone in Bangkok and then you will see them down in fucking Phuket in 3 months. You could meet someone in Phuket and then you might see them over in Da Nang in like 3 weeks' time. And long story short, I ended up setting up camp in Thailand for about 6 months. So I was living out there on my own for pretty much the duration of 2023. This was pretty much the start of how my training's totally changed. So through this time, through all the years of trying to get off the booze and then going to traveling in Thailand, I was still training hard as fuck. I've been building my fitness channels mainly on Twitter or X, whatever you want to say. So I was a fitness coach and my whole life still was fitness at this time. And becoming sober, I just sort of doubled down on the health and longevity and a vitality sort of side of things. Training was still a huge part of my life, but on that trip, I had probably the most life-changing event of my life to this point, where I actually came off a bike and broke my knee. And pretty much to this day, the doctors have said that you're pretty much incapable of doing any sort of long-term high-impact training around the knee. So obviously I still train as much as I can and it's got a lot better, but this was sort of a big change for my whole life, really, because now I can't really run. I can't do things like heavy squats. So, I'm sort of, my training had to change up a lot. And around this same time, I actually tore my bicep as well. So there I was pretty much back from Thailand, back in the UK with a broken knee and a torn bicep. And I was like, well, fuck, what do I do now? And obviously, with fitness coaching being my main gig, like that's what my whole profession, that's the route I'd gone down. I was like, well, I still need to train. And I managed to sort of finagle some certain exercises I could sort of train around. And I put together just a 2-day training split. And this was a bit of an unlock for me. I'd never seen anyone talk about training twice per week. And if I did, I'd shut it down and say that, like, that's for fucking absolute basic beginners. And the funny thing is, I still train twice a day to this day now. So it's been over 2 years at this point, and I've actually made more progress now training twice per week than I had probably 4 years combined prior to that. And I've now sort of developed a system where my whole life revolves around the lifestyle rather than actually fitting my life around my training. My training fits in the life. So I train on a Monday and a Thursday, and that's it for the week. I don't really do much cardio. So I've pretty much got 4 or 5 days a week of just pure recovery. So that's absolutely anything that I want to do. So whether that's a long hike, or whether that's sauna days, spa days, whether that's just chilling out, whether that's seeing friends and family, whether that's getting an extra day to work, whether that's I can spend more time cooking, shopping, doing meal preps. It just opened up so much more of my actual life whilst my body actually was able to rest and recover. So learning how to train 2 days was pretty much the biggest training unlock I'd had probably since I was about 18. And I noticed I was feeling so much better, which actually led me to how important focusing on energy really is, which is when I got into building a body via actually just living a great lifestyle. And this living the lifestyle side of it was something that I've never really gone down before until probably 12 to 18 months ago. And I've pretty much figured out now a system that I live by every day that I call the Limitless Protocol, that pretty much everything designed is to give you more energy. Everything I did in my early days, for where I was drinking, or for where I was eating the bro meals, or where I was falling asleep at my desk, where I had no drive and ambition, everything came back to, it's because I just had low energy. And I started to look at every little segment of health and fitness, of how can I manipulate this area to give me more energy. And that's became pretty much my life mission now, to help myself and the people I work with pretty much to feel the best that they can every single day without needing any of these supplements or stimulants, without needing to rely on things like caffeine and alcohol and things that are going to sort of be your crutch to lean on, and where you can just feel fucking great every day whilst hopefully building somewhat of a jack body. And this is what I think really comes down to living high frequency, is feeling fucking energy from within, feeling powerful in yourself, having like a non-arrogant presence, to just where you've got this sort of like vibe, this aura to you. I'm sure you know these people who just sort of radiate, like a high frequency sort of vibe. And I'm guessing 9 times out of 10, they're probably in pretty good fucking shape as well. They're probably, got some good sort of business success. Living this lifestyle body is the best way that I've personally seen to live. And if I had this probably 4 or 5 years ago, it would have saved me so much struggle through all the bollocks that I had to go through the doctors and the antidepressant thing and the tests and the anxiety and all of that stuff. So yeah, that's why this channel exists, because I want to give you the knowledge and the insights and everything I've learned over the past decade of all the struggles and everything, and just give you now what actually works. If you want to start doing something like this yourself and you're wondering where you should start, I've actually put together a full course completely free that you can get in the description, which is going to take you from that place of feeling exhausted and, low energy and drained and just feeling generally shit every morning, to what I've called 3 weeks to jumping out of bed. So if you click the first link in the description, you can go grab that. Or if you want to fast track this whole process and start getting results ASAP and actually get real long-term energy for life, then click the Work With Me link in the description and I will help you build your lifestyle body. Let's fucking go!